for the intellectually disabled. Well, I think you and I know the answer to that. All we got to do is listen to what's going on outside this chamber. And we listen day in and day out now for 3 weeks to women and men who have given their lives to the service of the less fortunate, the most vulnerable in our society, and they have basically watched while this government has thumbed their noses at them and the people that they serve. So this government does nothing in terms of dealing with issues of providing a fair working wage to the people that deliver such an important service, Mr. Speaker, and that certainly involves people in Halifax Atlantic. People on social assistance, Mr. Speaker, you know that the family benefits in the province of Nova Scotia, that the shelter component, the housing component, and the personal component has continued to decrease, that the level of funding for family benefits for people living in dire poverty, Mr. Speaker, has even failed to keep pace with inflation. And let me tell you that there are people living in dire poverty, men and women and children, families who come to my office in Halifax Atlantic in the Captain Spry Centre and try to get us to help them resolve their problems. How do they make ends meet when the resources that they receive from the province of Nova Scotia continue to decrease, Mr. Speaker? It's extremely difficult. Does this budget help those people in any way, Mr. Speaker? It doesn't help them in any way. It further penalizes them for being poor. In fact, they don't even get the $155, Mr. Speaker. What about affordable housing? There are thousands on the waiting list in Metro, in the HRM for affordable housing units, Mr. Speaker, including many in Halifax Atlantic, who have been on those waiting lists. Now, what happens to those people? Those people, those families, those women and men and children, individuals, are subject to, I would suggest to you, less than honorable landlords, Mr. Speaker. They are subject to conditions in the private sector that are less than satisfactory because they can't get into affordable housing units provided through Metro Housing. There needs to be the provision of more affordable housing units in the province of Nova Scotia, in Halifax Atlantic, throughout the Halifax Regional Municipality. Does this budget deal with that issue at all, Mr. Speaker? Not a bit. Doesn't address that problem at all for the constituents in Halifax Atlantic. There's a seniors building in Halifax Atlantic, Mr. Speaker, called the Captain Spry Lodge. It's one of those two-story units. There's a number of them throughout the province, a couple of them in industrial Cape Breton, as you probably know. There's no elevator. There's no elevator in this unit. So you have seniors, Mr. Speaker, who are maybe a few years from nursing homes. You have seniors that are trying to live independently, who go and get groceries and come home and live up on the second floor and have to climb 2 flights of stairs fully loaded with groceries. Mr. Speaker, that's the challenge that they face, and some of them, as a result of that impediment, not having an elevator, not having a lift of any kind to get them to the second floor, Mr. Speaker, have had to go into nursing homes. Increasing the costs to the province of Nova Scotia, but also increasing the cost of those individuals. And I'm going to talk about the cost of nursing home care in a second. But is there anything in this budget that provides that there will be a lift constructed, there will be an elevator provided for the people in the Captain Spry Lodge, Mr. Speaker, in spite of the commitment by a previous minister to those residents? There's nothing in this budget. There's been no indication to those residents whatsoever that there will be an elevator provided, even though one had been committed to them as recently as last fall. Nursing homes, let's talk a little bit about nursing homes. Let's talk a little bit about the fact that this government requires seniors who go to nursing homes to pay the full costs of their health care when in nursing homes. If they go to the hospital, or if they're in the Captain Spry Lodge, and they require health care services or services through the health care system, Mr. Speaker, those services are paid for. If they, let's say, because they can't get to the second floor anymore, their groceries, and there's no units on the first floor available to them, they have to go into a nursing home, they suddenly have to start forking out for the cost of health care, Mr. Speaker. Why? The government has acknowledged that that is wrong, that that is unfair, inequitable, discriminatory. Have they done anything about that in this budget, Mr. Speaker? Have they done a single thing in this budget? No, they haven't. They're going to deal with it, they tell us, by the year 2007. 2007. We're in 2003. In case anyone has forgotten, Mr. Speaker, the government are going to deal with something that they admit is wholly inequitable and discriminatory and wrong. They're going to deal with it in 2007. In 2007. The only hope that the people of Halifax Atlantic have is that an NDP government will be elected in the next election, and that problem will be resolved immediately, Mr. Speaker, because that has been a commitment by our leader and by our caucus. So what other problems are we? What other challenges are we facing out in Halifax Atlantic? Well, you've heard me talk at some length in this House over the past couple of years about a construction and demolition debris recycling project out in Harrietsfield. It's a community out past Spryfield, Mr. Speaker, where this company is collecting and transporting and receiving construction and demolition debris. They're sorting it, they pile it, and stuff that they can dispose of through recycling strategies, they do so. But they have also now applied to have an opportunity to dispose of, to dig holes in the ground and to dump construction and demolition debris that they can't recycle. And this is in a residential community, Mr. Speaker, and in the middle of a very sensitive environment where local wells and water courses are very much endangered as a result of this particular development. And have we been able to get any support from this government for those issues, for inspectors, for testing, and so on? Mr. Speaker, no, we haven't. In fact, that's been one of the communities that has had their water quality in wells affected as a result already of arsenic and uranium that exists. And you know what they have to do, Mr. Speaker? Each one of those property owners that have a well, they have to get their well tested by themselves. They have to take the test and send the water samples to a private lab here in Halifax that does the analysis for a cost for basic testing of $125, and for a couple of other items to be tested upwards of $180. So here you have families in Harrietsfield, Mr. Speaker, whose water is already under some threat as a result of circumstances there. In order to stay on top of it and make sure that the quality of water is safe for their families, for their children, they have to do the individual testing themselves. And on top of this now, there is a commercial operation whose very activity is going to further threaten the quality of the water in those communities. And what does this budget do to deal with that? Does it provide subsidies for water testing, Mr. Speaker? Does it provide any substance to the supposed water strategy that this government has for the province of Nova Scotia to help those owners, those property owners, those residents in Harrietsfield deal with this issue? Not a thing. There's not a thing in there, Mr. Speaker. Does it increase the capacity of the Department of Environment to monitor, to inspect, to enforce its own legislation so that the environment and the health of the people in Harrietsfield are not jeopardized further? Nothing. Not a thing, Mr. Speaker. Not a thing. In the face of questionable decisions, a questionable process followed by the local municipality, the HRM, this government, has it been a responsible recourse for the residents of Harrietsfield to go to help them, a higher level of government that in the face of a decision which many feel is wrong-headed, will they help correct the problems? They haven't been there. They haven't been there, Mr. Speaker, for these residents, and it's a problem. And on top of this commercial operation in Harrietsfield results in an extraordinarily increased traffic level of huge tandem trucks loaded down with debris, Mr. Speaker, traveling on roads that are at the best in terrible condition. They drive right beside and...
Order, please. There's far too much noise in the chamber. The only person that should be heard is the member who has the floor. The member for Halifax Atlantic.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The highway that travels through Harrietsfield, on which these trucks filled with construction and demolition debris are pounding the daylights out of a road that's already, a highway that's already in terrible condition, Mr. Speaker, and it also travels beside an elementary school with young children walking to and from school, walking along the side of that road. It's dangerous, Mr. Speaker. It's dangerous for the residents of Harrietsfield. It's dangerous for the people that drive through there in terms of the number of large trucks that are on that highway. And it also results in the increased and rapid deterioration of a highway that is also poorly maintained by the Department of Transportation. Is there anything in this budget? Is there anything addressed in Bill 36 that in any way helps the people of Harrietsfield-Williamswood deal with this problem, with this situation, this multifaceted issue. Not a thing, Mr. Speaker. It's extraordinarily and irresponsibly silent on that issue, as it has been on many other issues, Mr. Speaker. You know, there's also a problem in Halifax Atlantic, not just Halifax Atlantic, but throughout, of what is seen as almost uncontrolled. I have to say uncontrolled development. There's housing developments going up in a fashion that has absolutely no planning attached to it. Wherever a developer acquires land and decides that they want to build houses or apartment buildings or condominiums or whatever, that's where it happens. All they got to do is get it through the planning department of the Halifax Regional Municipality, Mr. Speaker. In spite of the fact that there hasn't been a municipal planning strategy for this area since 1987. Since 1987, Mr. Speaker, the municipalities themselves have changed, let alone the usage, the density level, the traffic patterns, the development. There's been so many changes, Mr. Speaker, over the nearly 20 years since that last municipal planning strategy was developed, and yet development is occurring at an increasing rate, and it's happening without any plan, without any input from the local area. Do you know, Mr. Speaker, that there was a development that has been recently approved, a large development of housing units, upwards of 12 to 1,400 units, for this piece of property that is right plunk in the middle of an environmentally sensitive area, has the potential, it's on rock, they start to blast, it has the potential to interfere with a whole chain of watercourses there, to impact on Colpit Lake and Williams Lake, the Macintosh runs, to interfere in the environment right down through to Herring Cove, Mr. Speaker. And the decision to approve this development was made in the face of overwhelming opposition at public hearings. And it was made by two councillors. It was made by two councillors, Mr. Speaker, neither of which live in the vicinity, neither of which represent anybody in the area affected. Now, how is that allowed to happen? How is that allowed to happen? If it was a meeting of full council, I mean, that's a very important decision that's being made. It could be not only devastating to the environment out there, but it also will create great demands and stresses on an already overstressed transportation system out to and through mainland South, Mr. Speaker. And this decision, very controversial decision, is made by two councillors, two of four councillors, neither of which represent the territory involved whatsoever. It's an absolutely shocking circumstance when you think about it, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure that mainland South or Halifax Atlantic is not alone in terms of that kind of a development happening. But my point in raising it here in relation to this budget is that, is there anything in this budget or is there anything in this bill that ensures that this government will have some influence on that kind of municipal strategy or lack thereof? Is there anything in this budget that will ensure that the Minister of Environment and his officials have the staff and the resources necessary to be able to provide the kind of protection that these residents and future generations deserve, because the consequences, Mr. Speaker, are going to be not just now, but for many years into the future. Once that granite is blown up, once the water courses are affected, once the trees are ripped down, once the soil is contaminated, then, Mr. Speaker, that's it. And it'll take many, many generations if any government is in a position or has the courage to try to correct the problems created. Is there anything in this budget that gives the residents of Halifax, Atlantic, and Mainland South some solace, some comfort, some confidence that that problem will be addressed? Absolutely none, Mr. Speaker, absolutely none. Let me before I go any further, before I go on to another issue, let me just talk about that issue of development a little bit longer. Do you know, Mr. Speaker, that there's a development project in Mainland South, and I understand that this is not a unique situation, where infill is required for a development, and it was identified that this infill that was used in this housing development was significantly contaminated. We have that information in writing, Mr. Speaker, and we will bring it forward at the appropriate time. The Minister of Environment's officials have confirmed that the soil was contaminated. The developer was given an ultimatum to clean up this mess on February the 9th. February the 9th, Mr. Speaker. Has anything been done to resolve that issue? Has anything been done to try to deal with the fact that we have contaminated infill moving around, passing from one site to the next, unless it goes undetected, throughout the Halifax Regional Municipality? Is there anything being done? Is anybody watching? Is anybody ensuring that the environment of this municipality is being protected? What is the Department of Environment doing? Is there anything in this budget that provides the Department of Environment with the resources to be able to resolve those kinds of problems, to be able to inspect, to monitor, and to enforce when there are infractions? Mr. Speaker, there's nothing there. There's absolutely nothing in this budget whatsoever. Let me move now to another issue.
Please do. What is it?
Since I was elected in 1991, Mr. Speaker, I have had a host of women and men through the door of my constituency office talk to me about problems that have resulted through an injury at work. This problem is in dealing with the Workers' Compensation Board. It was a problem that has been exacerbated by successive governments. The Liberals changed the law in the face of overwhelming opposition back in 1995, I believe it was, Mr. Speaker, which tightened the eligibility or made it more strict. The eligibility, Mr. Speaker, made it more difficult, created a waiting period, created other circumstances which meant that fewer people who had been injured at work would be eligible for workers' compensation. It reduced the level of income that would be replaced for those people who were injured at work through no fault of their own, simply as a result of going to work and trying to earn a living. And, Mr. Speaker, there continues to be problems of people who are eligible for compensation, people who are unable to work, who continue to be injured, being badly treated by the workers' compensation system. Now, there was an inquiry, a commission established, the Dorsey Commission, which made a report and recommendations of things that needed to be done in order to change improve the system, in order to make it more accountable, in order to provide benefits for some who had been excluded, and the government, most people have recognized that those exclusions were unfair. Is there anything in this budget which helps the people in Halifax Atlantic who are on workers' compensation, who are eligible for workers' compensation, who would benefit from the implementation of the Dorsey report, Mr. Speaker? Is there anything in this budget which helps resolve those difficulties, those challenges, which helps make life somewhat easier for people who are injured and unable to work through no fault of their own? Nothing. Nothing, Mr. Speaker. I spoke to a man the other night when I was out canvassing, Mr. Speaker, a man whose back had been ruined as a result of his workplace back in the early 90s. And I had worked with this gentleman on a number of occasions to help overcome problems in workers' compensation and so on. He's a young man. He's in his mid-50s. In his mid-50s, Mr. Speaker, his back is a mess. He can't work. And he continues to be called in by workers' compensation to explain why he's not doing this, or to explain what his problems are, and to go to doctors.
As if it's his fault.
Mr. Speaker, as if he's somehow trying to, squeeze an inadequate level of income as it is out of the system, instead of going to work, which is ultimately what he would like to do. His life, Mr. Speaker, has been ruined as a result of his injury. Has workers' compensation a system set up to properly replace the income lost by workers injured? Mr. Speaker, has it helped this man, and has it helped thousands of others? No. And does this budget and Bill number 36 do anything to solve his problem and to solve the problem of thousands that are encountered as a result of the weaknesses of the workers' compensation system? Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid that they do not. Mr. Speaker. Insurance rates. I talked to a number of people in the trailer park in Harrietsfield the other night about the problem of insurance rates. You know that the figures, I don't need to tell you, but I'm hearing it right on the doorsteps. I'm sure every member in this House is hearing it on the doorsteps. We are getting the results of studies in here, which show that there's an increase in drivers on the highway who have no insurance as a result of the skyrocketing rates of insurance in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. That jeopardizes you and me and our families and every other Nova Scotians that are driving. There are vehicles parked in the driveways of thousands of Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, because of the fact that they cannot afford to pay for their insurance. They cannot afford to operate their vehicle. Let me tell you that when you're living out in Harrietsfield or Williamswood or Sambro or Ketch Harbor and you don't have a car, let me tell you, life is tough. It's difficult for people living in any part of rural Nova Scotia. If you don't have a car, if you don't have a vehicle to transport yourself, how do you get around? How do you get to work? How do you go to medical appointments? How do you go to a hospital, Mr. Speaker? How do you look for work? You can't, because there's a lot of Nova Scotia that doesn't have public transit. There's no bus that travels out in the loop around Harrisfield, Williamswood, Sambro, Ketch Harbor, and up to Herring Cove. There's no public transit there. So not only is the whole business about insurance, the discrimination that's occurring at the hands of insurers, cutting people off, and the unconscionable jacking up of rates, not only does it hurt people in the pocketbook, but but it's actually having a material impact on their lives by taking away much necessary transportation, Mr. Speaker, which I'll talk about a little more, and I understand a member wants to make an introduction.
Thank you very much. The member for Colchester North on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for allowing me to make this introduction. Today in the gallery, thank you, David. The Speaker's Gallery, we have 15 students from the Cobequid Educational Centre, and they are taking grade 11 history, Canadian history, and they are accompanied by my son, Robert Langell, Peter Keveney, and Brent McPhee. And I'd ask that the House extend them a warm welcome of the legislature.
Thank you for the introduction, and yes, certainly welcome to our guests in the gallery, and welcome to all our guests in the gallery today. The honourable member for Halifax Atlantic has until approximately 15 more minutes in time here.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the issue of insurance rates is a very serious set of circumstances as it affects people in Halifax Atlantic. Let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, I've spoken to dozens over the past week who were absolutely exasperated by increases of 30, 40, 50% that are coming in the face of good driving records, good driving history, maybe as a result of age or the age of the vehicle, but as a result of decisions that have absolutely nothing to do with the individual. And Nova Scotians, people in Halifax Atlantic, understand that what's happening has more to do with the investment decisions that are being made in Toronto by the insurance companies, or in Geneva, Switzerland, or in Hartford, Connecticut, or wherever the head office of these international conglomerates actually exist, Mr. Speaker, that are setting the insurance rates that are so punishing to the women and men in Nova Scotia who need vehicles to drive. Is there anything in this budget that deals with that issue? Is there anything in this budget? Is there anything allowed for in Bill number 36 which will stop this gouging, which will stop the punishment that Nova Scotians are feeling as a result of these insurance rate increases, Mr. Speaker? Nothing. Nothing. The people of Halifax Atlantic, in the face of these kinds of extraordinary changes, these extraordinary costs, Mr. Speaker, what they hear from this House are not answers, are not solutions from this government, but they're told, you know, sounds like a tough situation. And we agree, we have to pay the rates too, and it's tough, right? And we'd like to do something about it, but we really don't want to know. And you can almost hear the wringing of hands. And there's going to be some plans. And there's going to be some plans, Mr. Speaker. And some people said to me this week when I was canvassing, is this government not doing anything about escalating rates because they are sucking back millions of dollars in added tax as a result, HST as a result of the increase in these rates, Mr. Speaker? That's what Nova Scotians are asking me. Does this government not care because they are actually getting their piece of me through the extra tax that I have to pay and these increased rates? People are feeling that way because they're not hearing anything from this government other than platitudes about we feel your pain and we'd like to be able to do anything, but you know, like the casinos, the insurance companies are big and tough, and you know, they won't like it very much if we treat them in a manner that is disrespectful. Just like workers who don't want to work in a smoke-filled environment. Don't want to have to jeopardize their health, Mr. Speaker. They want to work. They got to work support their families at the casino. They want to work in a smoke-free environment, just like every other worker in the province of Nova Scotia. But no. This government says insurance companies, casinos, Michelin, Sobeys, all these, these big companies, these big corporations, these friends of this government, we got to let them, we got to create exemptions for them. We got to give them a special deal. We can't be too hard on these people, Mr. Speaker. We can't be too hard on these people. So if you work in a casino, you're sucking back tons of smoke, secondhand smoke that we know causes cancer. Too bad. Because we don't want to tick off the insurance companies. If you're a counselor who works to provide important care, support, and services to intellectually disabled Nova Scotian small options homes, you want a fair wage? Tough bananas. This government can't afford it. If you are a worker in the province of Nova Scotia and there is a problem with violence in the workplace, this government has regulations in the minister's office to deal with these issues that haven't been brought forward by this government, successive governments. Sorry, we can't afford to bring in those regulations, those protections for you in the workplace. We can't afford it because we have to make sure we have a balanced budget. We have to make sure that come budget day, we can table a document outside and inside this house that plays that game of saying we can manage our finances. And all the while, $500 million deficit in capital construction in schools, Mr. Speaker. Our roads are deteriorating in Harrietsfield and Sambro, throughout Cape Breton and in Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley. The water systems, Mr. Speaker, are deteriorating. Workers are not getting a fair wage. How can the government in all conscience say that it's providing leadership, that it's solving problems, that it is managing in an even-handed and a balanced way the finances of the province of Nova Scotia when that's what's really happening? This budget doesn't do a thing to deal with those whole host of issues that are facing the people of Halifax Atlantic. But you know what's interesting, Mr. Speaker? It's almost like this budget exists and this place almost exists in a different world. Like this government doesn't seem to even have any relation to much of what's happening out there in the province of Nova Scotia. So in light of the fact that this budget doesn't deal with the real issues facing Nova Scotians, every day in the constituency of Halifax Atlantic, you have people who work at the Captain Spry Centre, provide important community supports, recreational services, library, social services, and other supports to the people of Halifax Atlantic. There's a board of directors there that meets, that has representatives from throughout the constituency that meet on a monthly basis or more, depending on the issues, and they work together to bring people together to solve problems. It was a teen health center that, one of the first in the province, that started out in Halifax Atlantic back in the early 90s, Mr. Speaker. It has become so successful. It has become so successful that it is a model for such centers in schools, high schools throughout the province. It has now even expanded its service to the community with a storefront operation in the local mall called Teen Scene.
All right, yeah.
Called Teen Scene.
Yeah.
These are examples, Mr. Speaker, of ordinary Nova Scotians working in the face of incredible odds and obstacles created by this government with no help, no support. In spite of it, Nova Scotians, people in Halifax Atlantic, recognizing the problem's got to be solved, the supports have to be in place, and they're going to do it in spite of this government. Shabukto Boys and Girls Club, Mr. Speaker, with a very few dollars and a lot of support from the community, this organization and chapter in Halifax Atlantic, which has existed on a shoestring for a few years, one year it's funded, the next year it's not, the next year it is, the next year it's not, has gotten support from the community through fundraising activities and others to where it's now stable, not entirely dependent on the government, and is providing an important service to children and youth in Spryfield. The Urban Farm Museum is a not-for-profit society that's set up in Halifax Atlantic that's working with people in the community that's uncovering, developing, exposing the history of the community, working with other groups to develop a community garden so that people can learn how to raise their own food and provide land and support. Mr. Speaker, these are examples of community-based activities, community-based organizations of women and men working together in their community to make it a better place. And you know what? It's too bad that we didn't have a government, Mr. Speaker, that recognized that with a little support, with adequate funding and education to provide special education. J.L. Ilsley High School, for example, Mr. Speaker, together with St. Paul's Family Resource Center, have provided education support for people requiring opportunity to bring up their education level through GED, the equivalency exams, and so on, and for people who have gotten through high school who are older, mature students to come back to J.L. Ilsley through St. Paul's and then with J.L. Ilsley working together to do different courses. They had a business course, a very successful business course out there for a number of years that was very much a part of the community where older people who had already graduated or had already left high school and were in their 20s were able to come back and get some skills and develop some skills. Mr. Speaker, that program is no more. It's been gone now for a year. This government failed to support it. The adult literacy programs at St. Paul's Family Resource were being cut and are now over as a result of the lack of support of this government. Now, in spite of that, Mr. Speaker, in spite of the obvious success of some of these programs, these community-based programs, this government has failed to support some of these issues. But I guess the point I want to make, and I've got to wrap up, Mr. Speaker, I only have a couple of minutes, is that this budget is woefully inadequate in addressing some of the significant challenges that face the communities in Halifax Atlantic. That it may solve this government's budget issue, but it doesn't solve the budget issues facing many families, many individuals, many community groups in Halifax Atlantic. Woefully inadequate, Mr. Speaker. So while the government wants to pat itself on the back, the people in Halifax Atlantic are saying, this government is not doing anything for us. Not me, they're saying, not me necessarily as an individual, but us as a community, us as a family, us as a group of people that are working together to make Halifax Atlantic, to make Mainland South, to make Spryfield, Sambro, and our communities better. This budget is not helping us. This government is not helping us. They will continue to do what they do, what good people of good conscience, people of the kind of character that that people outside of Nova Scotia have come to expect of Nova Scotians will continue to do what needs to be done to make the community a better place. And all they ask from a government is they recognize the need to provide some leadership, to pay attention to what's happening in the community and to support that community. This budget does not do that, Mr. Speaker. And for those reasons and others that I've cited in other instances that I've intervened is why I voted against the budget and why I will be voting against Bill number 36. Thank you.
Thank you. The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise and make a small number of observations on the Financial Measures Act. I suppose if one were to start, and perhaps even to pick up from where my colleague who just spoke, the previous speaker, in making reference to the amount of money that the government is making on hidden revenue through the insurance premiums that are charged to Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, last year the government, I believe, collected somewhere in the vicinity of $35 million in hidden taxes on insurance premiums across Nova Scotia. This year, with the spiraling rates, they will collect $48.5 million. That's an increase of $13.5 million over the previous year. Now, with the insurance companies just announcing that there'll be further rate increases, which, by the way, Mr. Speaker, I find a little suspicious that they all seem to be making these public pronouncements on or about the same period of time. It's almost as if, well, they pretty well know that if they raise these rates collectively, it's very difficult for Nova Scotians to criticize an individual company. And that way their market shares and their clientele will essentially remain the same. Well, Mr. Speaker, the disappointing part about the government's action to date on this, I think, can certainly be linked to the fact that the government will collect $48.5 million this year in additional in revenue through insurance premiums. It's disappointing that Nova Scotians, I'd be willing to bet, Mr. Speaker, that many Nova Scotians aren't even aware that they're paying a provincial tax on their insurance premiums, whether it be automobile, home, their business, their life insurance, or what have you, Mr. Speaker. Well, it's a hidden tax. Anytime you go to pay your insurance premium, that does not show unless you read the fine print. You pretty well have to read the fine print on those documents to realize that you're being charged a 3% tax on insurance premiums. And why did the government do that? So as to collect as much money as possible with the least amount of resistance from the general public. So perhaps this is one of the reasons the government is not moving ahead on doing some reform with the insurance industry and the spiraling rates. Mr. Speaker, I had one constituent just in the last several days, senior citizen. She was on a payment plan, and she was paying for her auto, never had an accident in her life, and she's nearly 80 years of age now. She was paying $55 a month. Doesn't sound like a lot, but you extrapolate that out. That's a fair bit of change over a one-year period. Her rate went from $55 a month to $118 a month for no justifiable reason that she could see. She had no accidents. She never lost her license. I don't believe this lady even had so much as a parking ticket in her lifetime that we could ascertain. So what's the rationale? You know, why is she paying so much more, and why is the government saying absolutely nothing on it? Well, why wouldn't they? They've just doubled the amount of tax that they've collected from this lady. So, Mr. Speaker, Perhaps this is the reason why the Minister of Environment and Labour is not taking action. He's trying to support the Minister of Finance, who has been gouging the consumers and the people of Nova Scotia for 4 years, Mr. Speaker. It's a little disappointing because the government says, we're going to give you a 10% tax break. Well, let's look at that. Are they really giving you a 10% tax break? There are a number of aspects to this, Mr. Speaker. Number one, in 1999-2000 fiscal year, the government decoupled its taxing system, provincial tax, from the federal tax. So what that means, in simple terms, is that when a Nova Scotian would receive a tax break from the federal government, it would automatically, before the decoupling, would receive a decrease in tax at the provincial level. And what did the province do? They said, no way are we going to allow that to happen. So we're going to break away from the federal system because it was on a percentage basis, I believe 45, 55%, and I could be off a few points on this, but essentially the message is there. So what the provincial government did is they decoupled, and the tax break that they got from the federal government, they stuck it to the consumers and to the tax-paying citizens of Nova Scotia. So they didn't receive the break that the federal government gave them. The provincial government surreptitiously removed that with no consultation whatsoever. And they continue to do that every year for the next 3 years, Mr. Speaker. And this year they're going to say, we're going to give you a 10% tax break. You should thank us, re-elect us, and everybody will be happy. But it doesn't stop there, Mr. Speaker. It doesn't stop there. It doesn't stop there. And it's good to see there's some life on that side of the floor. Mr. Speaker, they imposed over $500 million in user fees since this government came to power. $500 million, that's over $500 million more in user fees on top of those tax increments over the last 3 years. So, Mr. Speaker, this 10% tax cut that they're talking about, this $155 rebate that they're talking about, doesn't even scratch the surface of what they've done to the people of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I'll give you an example of how the people of Nova Scotia have been misrepresented, not only at the governmental level, by those in government that work for this Conservative government. Several weeks ago, we had a representative from EMO come before Public Accounts. Come before Public Accounts, Mr. Speaker. And one of the questions I asked, would he be kind enough to provide us with a list of the 911 fees that Nova Scotia has in relation to all the other provinces? And yes, true to his word, this particular gentleman was kind enough to supply that particular piece of information. But that's not the discouraging part, Mr. Speaker. It's the fact that this gentleman, in my view, deliberately and methodically did not provide the latest up-to-date information. Provided information that was 3 years old, Mr. Speaker, in a deliberate attempt to make all Nova Scotians believe that we had the lowest 911 user fees in this country, Mr. Speaker. And I will table this document, Mr. Speaker, when I'm finished. Mr. Speaker, cross-Canada comparison of 911 user fees as of July 2000. Oh, my heavens, I only asked this gentleman 3 weeks ago. I would suspect that he would at least have 2002 figures, if not 2003 figures. But that was a deliberate attempt, Mr. Speaker, to mislead this House, because at the very bottom, he had 2 notes. Four provinces have call-answer fees in place, and a 5th province, PEI, is establishing such a fee. Point number 1. Point number 2, Nova Scotia's fee at 36 cents per month, in brackets, net, would be the lowest of the 4 that are in place. And the 4 that are in place, Mr. Speaker, as of July 2000 was Saskatchewan, Alberta, British Columbia, and Quebec. And they ranged from, at that time, 37 cents for Alberta, 40 for British Columbia, 41 for Quebec, and 43 for Saskatchewan. And then there'd be the administration fee by the telephone company. Well, Mr. Speaker, we don't pay the lowest fee in the country. And I will prove it to you, and I'll also table this. This is a copy of just a telephone bill for this month. Nova Scotia's 911 emergency service, 19 cents. That's the fee that the telephone company charges. And for the Nova Scotia government 911 fee, 43 cents. Well, why in the name of heavens would that public servant deliberately and methodically mislead this House? He knew exactly what I was asking for, the latest up-to-date information. Why is this government allowing its civil servants to continually mislead members of this House and mislead Nova Scotians? You wonder why we don't trust this budget. You wonder why we don't trust what the government is saying when we have public servants coming before this House deliberately and methodically misleading and misrepresenting the facts. Mr. Speaker, I'll table that. Now, Mr. Speaker, that's not the first time this has happened. It's not the first time. The facts are we have the highest, we don't have the lowest, we have the highest user fee in the country. We have the highest, Mr. Speaker. When you take the administration fee from the telephone company plus the 911 fee that's going, we now have the highest. And this public servant sent us a document as of this morning saying that we had the lowest. Why, Mr. Speaker? Why do we have public servants coming and misleading this House? And we're asked to protect the interests of our constituents? How can we do that when we can't even get the facts? We can't even get accurate information. And then they have the audacity to publish all the vulnerable communities in this province that are at risk by saying which ones are the most prepared for a disaster or a terrorist attack or any type of a misdeed. The minister would stand up and expose the vulnerability of all these communities, whether it be Goldboro, the gas plant down there, or Stellarton, the power plants. All these types of issues. The minister would rather self-gratify himself by publishing this in the media to make it look like he's on top of things. Well, what's he done? He's not only exposed the vulnerability to the undesirables of society, but he's allowed his public servant to come before a committee of this House and misrepresent the facts. Does he not at least review some of this information before it's applied? Or is he sitting quietly as a partner, as members of this legislature are deliberately and methodically being misled with obsolete information? Mr. Speaker, it has to stop. It has to stop. That's why we can't support a budget when the government says, ferret it out. Ferret it out. I mean, this is not an Easter egg hunt. This is not an Easter egg hunt. This is not a game. If the government is looking for support, give us the facts. We're reasonable people. We can analyze it. Well, the member for Shelburne laughs. Maybe he does find it funny. He sits at public accounts. Maybe he finds it enjoyable. Maybe he finds it enjoyable, that the opposition members and the people of Nova Scotia are being hoodwinked into dealing with obsolete information every day, Mr. Speaker. Now, if we think that's something, Mr. Speaker, if we think that's something, there's more information coming from public accounts that will show a minister of this crown has misled this House on several occasions on a very important budgetary matter. Mr. Speaker, I will table these documents when I'm finished. They should be public to any member of the committee. But, Mr. Speaker, we recall the Nova Scotia Health the Health Care Research Foundation. I think all members would be familiar with that, members of the committee at least. And it kept showing up as a line item in the budget for 3 years consecutively as a $2.5 million charge to the department. And when questioned on that, the minister indicated, well, this was an amendment after the fact. This was an amendment after the budgetary process had been concluded. Okay? Well, what do? You take him at his word. So we asked a witness that came before public accounts for the documentation to verify what the minister was saying. And by golly, she was good. She was very good. She provided that. But what she provided, Mr. Speaker, was not what the minister said. It was totally contrary. For the 2 fiscal years, the first 2 fiscal years that this organization was up and running, the minister, according to these documents, Mr. Speaker, had clear evidence, had a submitted budget proposal that was submitted by the Nova Scotia Health Research Foundation, Mr. Speaker. And I will just refer to the 2 reference documents, Mr. Speaker. The budgets for the year 2000-2001 was submitted at the cutoff date, and it was submitted to the deputy minister and to the minister. Clearly, Mr. Speaker, the minister had that information before his document, his budget was prepared. And the submission was for a $5 million charge to his department, Mr. Speaker. It's here in black and white. So why would the minister stand in his place and say, oh no, that was an afterthought? But you know what's even more disturbing, Mr. Speaker? In these documents, and I can see why the minister didn't want to talk about it, because it refers to the fact that it will put pressures on other issues in the department. In other words, they're going to rob Peter to pay Paul. That's what they're going to do. And that's what they did. That's why the minister was so calm about it. He's now the Minister of Justice. But, Mr. Speaker, you can forgive and you can understand for 1 year. I could certainly understand. Let's say it was an oversight. But 2 years in a row, Mr. Speaker, 2 years, and the documentation was submitted on time by the representative of the Nova Scotia Health Research Foundation. Mr. Speaker, the document and the request, the budgets, even for this particular fiscal year, Mr. Speaker, 2000, well, the one we just concluded, for the 2003 fiscal year, for the 2002 fiscal year, and the one beyond that. And they're there, and they were all submitted before the deadline. So how the Minister of Health, who's now Minister of Justice, could have stood in his place and said, oh, that was an afterthought. Well, clearly, the correspondence was sent to his office. Why would he do that? Why would he put members of the opposition, it doesn't matter which party, why would he put the people of Nova Scotia in such a misrepresented position, Mr. Speaker? I'll table this. I see a very perplexing look on many of the faces on the government benches. Could I get a copy, and also a copy of the other documents at table? Mr. Speaker, well...
Order. The Minister of Justice on a point of order.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know what the honourable member is talking about, but I expect it's the 10th time, maybe 15th time we've heard it from him in this House. Now, I was wondering if he was going to get on to new information, which I think is required. Thank you.
Well, I understand the rule of repetition. Thank you, member from Preston. But I think as long as he's still focused on the Financial Measures Act and is still focused on a specific issue that he's not repeating consistently on this particular issue, then I think he's well within his rights to speak on the issue. Member from Cape Breton West has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The minister wants evidence. Well, let me refer to one letter that was sent to the minister. and it was signed by Colleen Clattenburg for Hugh Gillis, Chair of the Board of Directors for the Nova Scotia Health Research Foundation. Would the minister who was in the department at that time, would he have the vaguest recollection of receiving any representation where they submitted not only their formal request for that year, but also for the following year? That request was October 11, 2001, and the next one was February 12, 2002. Mr. Speaker, is that the documentation? Is that the evidence he's looking for? Maybe he didn't get a chance to read the paperwork in his own department when he was there. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'll also table for the minister a copy of the budget proposals that were submitted to his department at that time. Now, if that's the evidence he's looking for, that's as clear as I can make it. Now, if he's still having a problem understanding that, Mr. Speaker, is it little wonder that members of the opposition would not want to support this budget. Because the minister, by his own admission, can't even recall the issue being before his department. He can't even recall the official representation that was made to the Honourable James Muir, Minister of Health. And, well, at that time, he was the minister. So if he's looking for new evidence, that's as clear as you can get it. So my suggestion is, don't focus on health issues anymore, because you've done enough damage. You've done enough damage. Mr. Speaker, it's an issue of confidence. It's an issue of trust. It's an issue of really getting down to believing whether the government has really put its true agenda on the table. Mr. Speaker, we've seen where the government was able to come up with $2.5 million. And by the way, I would ask if the page who was kind enough to get a copy of those documents for me would also get a copy for the Minister of Justice, so he can, even though he's not in health anymore, he wanted the evidence. The Health Research Foundation. It's important that he at least get the information that was sent to him, albeit that it's a year or two after the fact that he's looking for this evidence. So that might help him a bit. Mr. Speaker, that's why we're suspect. You know, we had the Deputy Minister of Finance come before Public Accounts days ago. And I believe the summation was that we have a debt of approximately $11.6, maybe $11.7 billion. And then we also have the unfunded liability of all the different insurance programs, you know, for the public service and other agencies in government, you know, Teachers' Pension Fund and so on. We're still waiting for some clarification as to whether that $1.5 billion is included with the 1.6 or 1.7 billion or $11.6 billion. Because if it isn't, we're looking at well over 12, almost $13 billion. You know, that's serious. That's puts it in a far worse position than the rosy picture that was being painted by the Minister of Finance over the last number of months. Mr. Speaker, borrowing $118 million to give a rebate of $68 million, what we've done, we've increased our debt. And the higher the debt is clearly demonstrated, the lower the credit rating and the higher the interest charges, because our ability to borrow is restricted, so we become a high risk. So high risk clients generally pay a higher premium. Why would the government, why would the Minister of Finance want to further put Nova Scotians at risk? Simply because they're trying to curry some favor in an election. That's not the way to do it anymore. Those John Buchanan days are gone, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, look at issue by issue. Issue by issue. Now we have the debt services of the province. In other words, the cost of our borrowing. has now gone from where it was at one time. It was perhaps one of the lowest in government, and I know this has taken quite a few years, but even since this government has taken over, Mr. Speaker, it was the number 3 budgetary item as far as expenses. Department of Health is number 1. That's pushing close to the $2 billion mark. We have education, which is somewhere in the $900 million mark. Now we have the debt servicing charges pushing the $1 billion mark. So it's exceeded. It has exceeded education. Now, I know the minister has made reference to sinking funds and so on, but there are a lot of appendices to the issue that the Minister of Finance has spoken on. But you can't just allocate it to one issue and not the others. If you appropriate that equally, then still servicing the debt is the number 2 item on the budgetary scale. Mr. Speaker, we see what's happening with these health care workers outside of Province House here, and I think we'd be remiss not to acknowledge the reality of the situation. The question I would have is, what's the real cost? What's the real cost? Not to the government, and not just to the healthcare workers or to the individuals, but what's the cost to these special needs Nova Scotians? What's the real cost of having them in such a state of turmoil and uprooted from their homes and a very conducive and loving and caring environment, I would suspect, without any other hesitation on that, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Community Services has indicated earlier today that there is additional money in the envelope other than what's on the table, you know. Now, I think if the Minister of Community Services has provided the employer with additional monies that doesn't seem to be on the table, he has an obligation to stand up and clarify his statements. You know, that placating, you know, those that ask the questions in such a half-hearted fashion does not answer the issue at hand. I think we have to know what's on the table. If the Minister of Environment and Labour and the Minister of Community Services, or indeed if the Premier feels that they're being paid enough, I believe that's what the Premier was saying, that, you know, what they believe that they're being paid a good, fair wage presently, and they're quite content to accept that, the Premier and the government. Now, if they feel that strongly about it, Mr. Speaker, why don't they just bypass, you know, all these little stations and go right to arbitration? Exactly. You know, mediation obviously hasn't worked. You know, arbitration, you just upping the ante a little, go to binding arbitration. Mr. Speaker, you know, what was the whole purpose of this Kendrick report? Was it for the minister to have some after-hours reading and muse about what he might do on a future day? No, Mr. Speaker. This was a report that was commissioned by government to take some specific action for the special needs citizens of this province. And he's not doing it, you know? And then on a previous day, he'll stand up and boast about, well, you know, we did receive $11 million from the federal government for housing. We only spent $2 million, and we're not quite sure what we're going to do with the other $9 million. Why not? It's not your money. The federal government sent that down to help the citizens of Nova Scotia, not for you to play politics with it. Help Nova Scotians. You know? Just don't sit there as if, you know, they're tone deaf to reality of what the people of Nova Scotia are saying. People need help, and they need it now. These healthcare workers will do far more for Nova Scotia when they're back at their workstations, where they do what they do best. And Mr. Speaker, I'm just absolutely amazed, especially in about Metro here, the Tory backbenchers that sit in total silence. You know, I don't know, it's almost like somebody took invisible masking tape and put it across their lips. They're not allowed to talk. Well, maybe that's just what they're doing. They're towing the party line. Politics comes before people. Well, I would hope not. I know some of these ladies and gentlemen, they're fine people. But why don't they stand up for the constituents that sent them here? Why aren't they? Why aren't they standing up and voicing their opinion on this piece of legislation? Why aren't they standing up and speaking on behalf of the healthcare workers and the families and the special needs citizens? Well, Mr. Speaker, they all can't get in cabinet. They all can't get in cabinet, and they become delusionary if they think that they're going to. You know, I listened with interest this morning as the member for Preston went on great concern about, you know, the dumping of garbage down in his constituency. Very good. The only reason he spoke up is because the local councillor decided he was going to do something. Well, he brought it to the attention of the people in the Department of Transportation and Public Works 20 times, which is 19 and a half more than you did. You come in a day late with too little. You know, we'll supply you the garbage bags if you don't want to go out and start working at it. He's been here for 4 years and he did nothing on the issue. Because if he did, it wouldn't be on CBC. Simple as that. And the local councillor, Councillor Caldwell, would not have to be doing what is obviously a provincial responsibility.
Order.
Mr. Speaker?
Order. I've given the member from Cape Breton West a bit of leeway, but I don't know if the issue of a dump in the riding of Preston is directly related to the finance. And well, if it is, the member maybe can help explain to us how that's connected to the Financial Measures Act. Thank you.
Well, it's very easy. Very easy. They're not tone deaf anymore, so now I can tell them how it's related. Because the communications director within the Department of Transportation and Public Works indicated that it would cost between $60,000 and $70,000 to clean up that mess. That's how it's related. It's a budgetary matter. And it's on provincial lands. And the member for Preston says that he's been on top of the issue. Well, what has he done? What has he done to get that $60,000 from the Department of Transportation to go out to Preston and clean up that mess? Now, that's a fair question. That's related to the Financial Measures Act. Never mind picking on the councillor because he's out there doing something. You join hands with him and go and get the job done too. You have the wherewithal to do it. You're in government on that side of the house. You can tap the Minister of Transportation and Public Works on the shoulder and say, get that mess in my riding cleaned up and get it cleaned up now because it's on provincial property. If that was on my property or the member for Colchester Musquodoboit Valley or the member for Truro, if it was on their property, the Department of Environment and Labour would have them charged in no time. Environment and Labour. And what's he doing? That's a fair question to ask. Why isn't he doing something? And yes, it is related to the Financial Measures Act. So those that have come alive with glee thinking that I was off base are soon to discover that it is a budgetary matter.
I recognize the Minister of Community Services on a point of order.
A point of order is that the member from Preston has worked very diligently on this, both during his municipal career and as MLA. I know he gave me a personal tour of the area, explained many of the things he's done and he is doing in the community. So I think that for the honourable members from Cape Breton West's information, he'd be very pleased to know the honourable member from Preston is doing a great job. Thank you.
Thank you. Order. Order. That wasn't a point of order, in case someone might have thought it was. I recognize the member from Cape Breton West.
Mr. Speaker, I I want to acknowledge what the minister has put on the floor here for the members of the legislature. If he's been doing such a great job, why is it that so many people are upset? And why is it that officials within the Department of Transportation and Public Works are saying they're not going to do it because they don't have the money to do it? So we don't want him waxing any more eloquence. He can't even look after things in his own department because we have strikers in front of Province House that prove that. So don't get up and wax that type of diatribe, in my view. If the member for Preston was getting the job done, I congratulate him. I mean, let's look. Talk about taking a tour of the site, Mr. Speaker. Look at the logbook for the number of flights that were taken by government in the last year. If they're traveling around, my heavens, the Department of Environment and Labor, they only logged 21.6 hours for the entire year. You know, and that's out of nearly 1,600 hours of flight time at a cost of anywhere from $300 to $800 an hour. Why wouldn't some of that money, Mr. Speaker, close to $550,000 go towards cleaning up that site in Preston, rather than flying around looking at the sites? We're not interested in having, those aviation tourist cabinet ministers. We're interested in cleaning up the site in Preston. So maybe, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Community Services would be well advised to encourage his cabinet colleagues to redirect those dollars from the air to the ground to clean up the mess. That's what I would do. Never mind flying around the province, taking tours, and charging more money to the taxpayers. So maybe the Minister of Community Services would engage in a rather lively debate about how that money could be better spent to help his colleague from Preston. I think that's fair. And the member for Preston, he knows that I would stand here gladly and congratulate him if I thought he played an active role in cleaning up that mess. He knows that. And I'll be the first to admit it. But he hasn't done it. So, because if he hasn't done it, if he had done it, the mess wouldn't be there. And if it's a more systemic problem than as he suggests, then obviously his preventative measures haven't worked either. And I think that's a legitimate concern. So never mind spending $500, and I'll table that for members of cabinets who may not have this information, vital information. Can I get a copy? It seems like we have to be providing them with the financial information so they know what's going on in their own departments. Like the Minister of Community Services, you won't have to worry about his flights, his flight plan, the logs, because he didn't even get off the ground. That's the only department that didn't charge anything to the plane service. So either he used a bicycle or he drove out. Now, unless the member for Preston took him out, and that's great, So maybe he could take him to some other places. Maybe he could take him to some of these special needs homes where these special needs Nova Scotians are looking for some leadership. If he says there's extra money in the envelope, what extra money is he talking about? I mean, I was absolutely astounded to think that the Minister of Community Services would actually engage in that type of debate outside the collective bargaining process. And I think he realizes that he was over the line on that. But it's public record, so you can't take it back. It was his own choosing to put that issue on the table. He's the one that said there's more money in the envelope. How much money is in the envelope? Over and above the 2, 2, and 2 that the minister referred to. And it's his own admission to the media here this morning on the steps of the legislature that there was more money in the envelope that was provided to the employer. Where is it at and how much is it? So, Mr. Speaker, that is a budgetary item. That's related to the Financial Measures Act. How can we support something when he won't even tell us what we're supposed to be supporting? It's not just blind faith, In the final analysis, tell me one Nova Scotian, if you gave them $155, that wouldn't take it. If they felt they more than paid for it, they'll take it. They deserve it. I mean, if I had my way, I'd try and put more money in their pocket. You know, it's not easy. It doesn't matter what side of the house you're on. I mean, there are a lot of pressures, but it's the process and the methodology that's behind it, which is what's really turning off a lot of Nova Scotians. They're not duped by this kind of politics anymore. Although I will say, Mr. Speaker, that the Premier, upon election, indicated that in year 4, that there would be, and I don't have the document here in front of me, but I'm going by memory, and one of the ministers can correct me, indicated there would be some relief. Yes, I believe that's correct. And true to his word. But he didn't say that he was going to go and borrow $118 million. Because how can you say you have a balanced budget if you went and you borrowed $118 million? In other words, we spent $118 million more than we took in. That's not a balanced budget. I don't care. They can call it whatever they want. They call it balanced budget. They can call it balanced 100 times. It doesn't matter. If you spend $118 million more than you collect in taxes, that's not balanced. So that's what the people of Nova Scotia will be looking at, Mr. Speaker, when the candidates start going door to door. They will be asking some serious questions. You know, why would the opposition not support this? Legitimate. That's a legitimate thing. As a matter of principle, the history of this legislature pretty well demonstrates that opposition will generally oppose the budget for a number of reasons. One, because of the varied philosophies on how to appropriate the resources of government, you know, the tax dollars on different programs and so on. So our priorities would be slightly different. It's not that we oppose a rebate to Nova Scotians, per se, not at all. It's also an issue of the fact that the government has gone out and borrowed the 118, like I've indicated, to pay back 68. The debt is going up. Our interest charges are going to go up. And all these right-wing conservatives on that side of the house that came here, you know, in such an altruistic fashion, saying, we're going to live within our means. You're not living within your means by doing this. So the Financial Measures Act, Mr. Speaker, speaks very clearly to the departure of what they said they were going to do and the reality of what's happening. And that's reason number 2 why the opposition opposed the budgetary process that was put forth, this budget. Mr. Speaker, the people of Nova Scotia have had quite a bit thrown at them in the last few years, and even previous administrations. It was pretty tough for them because, albeit the argument as to when deficits really start or the debt really started to grow or not, it really spiraled under the John Buchanan administration from 78 to 92, when he made an unceremonious departure. And Mr. Speaker, that's when we almost went to the verge of bankruptcy with Nova Scotia Resources Limited, the Workers' Compensation Board, the Nova Scotia Teachers' Pension Fund, and you name it. Just about everything in government. They spent money like drunken sailors. They did. I've never seen anything like it. And the Savage administration did get a handle and took us from the brink. And we were moving along quite nicely, and then all of a sudden we're back here. And you know, the bonding agencies now have us rated as the second lowest in the country. Newfoundland is the only province that has a credit rating worse than Nova Scotia. only Newfoundland. And we can understand because of the history and the difficulties that Newfoundland has experienced over the years. But if we're doing that great, why have we slipped? Why have we slipped, Mr. Speaker? We've slipped because the government keeps borrowing money every year. It has borrowed in excess of $100 million, more than it took in taxes or got from the federal government every year. So it's not a balanced budget. A truly balanced budget? It's not. It is not. I will debate that with anyone. You don't have to be a chartered accountant or you know, a whiz in math to figure out that when you borrow, you have to go to the bank and borrow $118 million to be able to meet all your financial obligations. You've obviously spent more than you've taken in. Simple as that. And all those conservative backbenchers that are over there, you know, sitting so quietly, not doing about it. Which brings me to a slightly different issue, but yes, Mr. Speaker, related to the Financial Measures Act. And that is the article that was in yesterday's Daily News, or Wednesday's, I suppose. And it's called Reflections of a Proud Monarchist by the member for Kings North. Mr. Speaker, that is a deflection. That is a deflection away from the real issues that we have to debate in the Financial Measures Act. This is a distraction for all members to have to be looking over our shoulder and competing with that type of issue. One week he wants to jump outside of his skeleton and criticize everybody in here on all sides of the House. The next day he wants to be an MLA. We need members like the member for Kings North to stay in here and debate the issues such as the Financial Measures Act, get on his feet and explain to us why he votes for this budget. Defend it. Stop musing about everybody else's capacity, professionally, personally, historically, whether they're monarchists or they're not, and musing about all these things. We need members like the member from Kings North in here to enter into a dialogue, a debate on the Financial Measures Act. Mr. Speaker, we cannot have those type of political distractions because that takes away from the process. This is an extremely important document, the Financial Measures Act. Mr. Speaker, we have flooding problems down through the valley in that member's very own constituency. They need help. They don't need resolutions alone, just congratulating them about selling tickets on a quilt or a tapestry. They need leadership. That's what we're elected for. We're MLAs in this legislature to do our job for Nova Scotians, not to muse about other MLAs on a daily basis. The Financial Measures Act is the most important signatory of any government. And we need every MLA to participate. We don't need half-hearted cheerleaders, irrespective of what their political philosophy is, Mr. Speaker. And given the sheer mounting evidence demonstrating quite clearly that members on this side of the House, both in the Liberal and the NDP caucuses, have been misled on numerous occasions by representatives from different departments, by ministers in this House, how can we have any confidence of what's in that document? It's really what they say. There are too many questions. Too many questions, Mr. Speaker. And yes, not enough answers. Mr. Speaker, I pointed out on a number of occasions the importance of providing accurate and timely information so that all members would be able to draw their own conclusions. And, you know, we'll listen to, let's say, for example, let's pick a Department of Transportation and Public Works. And the minister boasts about all the extra millions of dollars that have been put into the budget this year. Well over $105 or $106 million, up from 60-some million when they first came to power. What he forgot to say, Mr. Speaker, is what percentage of that is federal dollars? And why hasn't the Tory government laid out this road plan that they said that they were going to do in their Blue Book? You don't see them referencing the Blue Book the last few days, because the more we get into the meat of this budget, the more we see that they've deviated. They've deviated away from their master plan. Because do you know why, Mr. Speaker? It doesn't match with their political agenda. Mr. Speaker, it doesn't match with their political agenda. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Health is complimenting me on my speech, and I appreciate that. Yes, he's a fair-minded man. So, well, anyway, I don't want to be distracted by rabbit tracks, Mr. Chairman. I know my colleague from Dartmouth East has made an announcement a little earlier today, and I certainly want to go on the record as indicating that I'm very proud to have served with the member for Dartmouth East. I'm still on the waiting list. I asked him to get me some help over the years, but he's still working on it. But I'm very proud, Mr. Speaker. He's made invaluable contributions to Nova Scotia, particularly through the budgetary process. In the Departments of Health, Justice, and a number of other departments, and his care and compassion for Nova Scotians, particularly the disadvantaged, Mr. Speaker, his record is unblemished. I think many Nova Scotians, many Nova Scotia politicians can be very proud of that track record that Dr. Smith and the dignity to which he brought to this House. I know he's been very much aware of the situation that's happening with the RRSS workers, and every day he's constantly coming up with some different ideas on how we might be able to help not just the workers, but indeed those special needs residents. Mr. Speaker, the government is, I think, been a little unfair. You know, they have this divide and conquer philosophy. I'm not going to be repetitive on that issue too much, because I made reference to the fact that some Nova Scotians will get the rebate and others won't. But let's look at it from a slightly different perspective. The majority of these healthcare workers that are protesting outside the legislature, they're women. And many of them are not full-time workers. So they want benefit from an RSP process at all. You know, this retirement savings plan that the minister waxes eloquence on. It's just not there. Mr. Speaker, you look at the latest report from the Workers' Compensation Board. Do you know that the percentage of women that have been injured in the marketplace has increased over the last year? It's gone up from 65% up to 67%. Doesn't sound, or I'm sorry, I do apologize, from 33% to 35%. It doesn't sound like a significant number, but when you're dealing with tens of thousands of workers in Nova Scotia, that's a significant increase. What we saw down at the Casino Nova Scotia just in the last few days is just an example. That's like a snapshot in time of what's happening. And it demonstrates the somewhat patronizing attitude that the government has on women's issues in the marketplace. Mr. Speaker, 2 years ago, I raised the issue of worker safety at the casino about 2 workers that were forced to quit because they refused to work in a smoking environment. I tabled those documents, Mr. Speaker. And when they filed a complaint with the Occupational Health and Safety Division of the Department of Labor, they were cut loose. They were cut loose. And Mr. Speaker, those 2 cases that I raised at that particular point in time, they're as real today as they were 2 years ago. And I wasn't surprised to hear about that ruling, not one bit. But that's indicative of what's happening. And yes, the number of injuries to female workers in this province is going up. And you know where it's going up? Particularly in the health and social services sector. That's where it's going up. And that's on page 38 or 36 of the latest report from the Workers' Compensation Board. So clearly, Mr. Speaker, there is considerable stress and pressure on many of these healthcare workers that have not been there before. And I would submit, and I just have this 1 year here, which gives you a 2-year projection in time. These women, I'll bet you, if we were to look at the other reports, there's been a significant increase over the last number of years. And this here will continue to happen. There will be more and more injuries in the workplace with the female workers because of the pressures. And yes, because of the strains that are put on them, because of the low pay and the working conditions. Mr. Speaker, I think it's unfair. Unfair. And so the government, by the way, and talk about a budgetary item, I'm just absolutely astounded as to why this government would allow Mr. David Stewie to be exiting from the Workers' Compensation Board. A CEO that has brought the unfunded liability from 75% down to 24%, or reverse, 76% fundability, or 75% fundability. That's a phenomenal job. Is it because this government wants him out of the way because he wouldn't go along with any attempt by this government? Since they put it over under Policy and Management Board through the Financial Measures Act, as you will recall, Mr. Speaker, when they did the realignment of government departments. That's opening the back door so they can get in and do what John Buchanan's era did. Manipulate the rates, and you'll see, I'll make the prediction today as I did 2 or 3 years ago, you're going to see the unfunded liability go back up, and you're going to see this government, in an effort to curry votes with the electorate, they're going to try and manipulate the rates and use it for political gain. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? We'll be back worse than we were before. The Deputy Minister himself has indicated that we have $1.5 billion in unfunded liability in pension plans. We can't afford to go back and have the workers' compensation bank account purged again by another Tory administration. We can't have it. Mr. Speaker, I realize my time is getting short. I have 1 minute. Mr. Speaker, I think many of the points that I've made, I think clearly demonstrate why we on this side of the legislature are somewhat suspect of some of the issues in the government. And let's not, in fair, there are some good issues in this budget. There are, and I'll be the first to say it. But there are a lot of other issues, and as ministers can appreciate, when we have public servants come before this House misleading elected representatives, whether it's for political purpose or whatever, Mr. Speaker, that's why we have lost confidence in this government and the process by which they're trying to achieve the success of the Financial Measures Act. With that, Mr. Speaker, I thank you for this opportunity to speak on this bill.
recognize the member from Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, before I get into the Financial Measures Act, I just want to acknowledge the honourable member from Dartmouth East as well. The honourable member from Dartmouth East, I believe I first met in 1988 when, in fact, I was a member of the Dartmouth City Council. And the honourable member for Dartmouth East certainly visited the council chambers from time to time on a number of important issues that he felt were pertinent to the city of Dartmouth. And I want to say that I acknowledge the tremendous work that the honourable member from Dartmouth East has done on behalf of his constituents, on behalf of the city of Dartmouth, and on behalf of the province of Nova Scotia. I think there's a lot to be said with respect to those of us who enter public life. We often get a lot of criticism, but the tremendous hours and time and work that we have to put in to serve in public life is often forgotten. And for that particular reason, Mr. Speaker, I certainly want to acknowledge the member from Dartmouth East on his retirement. Certainly wish him the best in the future years in all of his endeavors, and I know that he will succeed on that. I certainly know he will succeed, Mr. Speaker, in whatever he does, because he's the kind of individual who makes sure he succeeds. Mr. Speaker, I want to begin where I actually left off on, I believe it was Tuesday evening, April the 29th, when in fact I adjourned debate on then what was called the financial measures, and there was an amendment to the financial measures bill, and there was an amendment called the hoist. And the hoist would have left this Financial Measures Act to be set aside for a 6-month period. And to set it aside for a 6-month period so that we could go across the province and discuss the items that were a part of this Financial Measures Act with all Nova Scotians, and that all Nova Scotians would have the opportunity then to participate in the Financial Measures Act and to provide input. Mr. Speaker, that didn't happen. And Mr. Speaker, I must say that I guessed that would not happen. Consistently, year after year, since I've been here in the last 5 years, the same approach has been taken to hoist the Financial Measures Act and then to put it on the road. And each year the government has voted the 6 months hence out, and they did that again yesterday, as a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker. So today we're back in return on the actual bill, on the motion the bill that's before us, the Financial Measures Act, Bill number 36. And Mr. Speaker, I was hoping that, in fact, I would get some pertinent information from the member of Kings North when he spoke in late debate about the government's tax relief meeting the criteria for social fairness and economic effectiveness. Mr. Speaker, certainly that didn't happen as well. The member for Kings North had spoken on the issue, but he certainly skirted the issue of how the government set out the criteria for social fairness and economic effectiveness. And Mr. Speaker, I would want to say that it was a lesson in itself, because it dealt with respect to the $155 that those 433,000 Nova Scotians will get once this Financial Measures Act is passed. But what it didn't do is it didn't deal with the $155 that will not be given to the 300,000 Nova Scotians, whom in fact will not benefit from opening up their mailbox and receiving a check. Those 300,000 Nova Scotians, each and every one of those members who represent the constituencies on the government side, will certainly meet some of them. There's no question. And who makes up those 300,000 Nova Scotians who will not receive that $155 check? There will be seniors, persons on disabilities, persons who are receiving income assistance, and even those who are working poor, who will not have paid $1 into the provincial government's tax in order to be a recipient of the $155. Those are the individuals, Mr. Speaker, who will not benefit from this. And I have always said, Mr. Speaker, that when a government balances budgets and creates surpluses, that all Nova Scotians should be the benefactor of that, who should be a recipient of the spoils of government by bringing that forward. Mr. Speaker, it's most important that we look at today's families and make sure that today's families benefit from that $155 tax benefit. Not only a certain segment of today's families, but all of today's families. And Mr. Speaker, that means single parents, seniors, the working poor, all those are a part of our today's families. And if in fact certain individuals are going to be the recipient of the $155 tax rebate that's coming in the mail, then everyone should. I can assure you, Mr. Speaker, I don't know, I must say, first of all, Mr. Speaker, I don't know if in fact the Minister of Finance has made this decision on his own, if in fact it was a cabinet decision, or if in fact caucus had a role to play with respect to this $155 check that's coming out, I think possibly around election time, that being this June. I think the government has actually mentioned that the checks are hopefully coming forward in mid-June. I think that has already been mentioned in the legislature. If that's the case, I'd like to know if in fact there was this was a cabinet decision, if caucus played a total role in this, and if caucus didn't play a total role in this, caucus should have played a total role, because they will meet the constituents out there who will not be the recipient of these this check in the mail. Most importantly, Mr. Speaker, one would have thought that the Minister of Community Services would have certainly played an important role and the government divvying out the spoils of the surpluses to those Nova Scotians. The government can rightly say that it is meeting one of its mandates in the Blue Book, Mr. Speaker, but the government also knows that everyone should benefit from the spoils of a tax surplus. Tell you, Mr. Speaker, that many of the individuals who will not benefit from this will remember. And those individuals who will benefit will think that this government has taken a crass approach to politics and decided to buy their vote. I think in both ways, this government loses. And this government had the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to make sure that everyone would be a recipient of those tax dollars. Better still, Mr. Speaker, the government could have decided that rather than give a tax break, that it would forego that commitment in the Blue Book, and that it would look at the programs and services that it would provide to Nova Scotians, particularly those Nova Scotians who are less fortunate. The some $68 million, Mr. Speaker, that has been allocated for this $155 check in June could have then been set aside to enhance some programs and services. Obviously, Mr. Speaker, the minister must have been aware that there would be collective agreements coming forward, and there would be the need for negotiations, and that there would be the need to set money aside. The Minister of Community Services must have informed his government that there were some number of contracts under his leadership that would need to be addressed. And I'm talking about particularly the strike that's occurring out there now, the strike by the RSS. They're going into their fourth week. We know the job that they do, Mr. Speaker. The government is aware of the job they do. It's a job that neither you or I or anyone else would be prepared to commit to every day, 7 days a week. These individuals are truly dedicated to that job, and all they're asking for is a fair wage for the job that they do. Is there anything wrong in that? I see nothing wrong in requesting a fair wage for the job you do. The Minister of Community Services, the Minister of Finance could have very well said, look, here's a special service to our most vulnerable Nova Scotians, those family members and friends who have intellectual disabilities, whom we know need the programs and services that should be provided to them by government. Therefore, we're going to set aside the dollars that is needed to make sure that this collective agreement sets forth. The Minister of Finance nor the Minister of Community Services is willing to budge on this item, yet $68 million has been set aside for the $155 tax rebate. I would say that many Nova Scotians would appreciate, or certainly hope the government would move in the direction of making sure that our most vulnerable benefited before a tax break was set forth. The people of our RSS, I should say the councillors of our RSS who are on strike, provide the kind of valuable service that both this community needs, the family needs, and we know that they rightfully deserve. I know that there is some pressure being placed upon the councillors of our RSS, those individuals who are on strike now, and it's being placed upon their shoulders by the family members, some family members, according to yesterday's newspaper article. And I want to say that that may be somewhat unfairly placed, because now the family members certainly understand the kind of dedicated services that the RSS councillors have been providing to their family members and those individuals with intellectual disabilities. They understand how difficult it is to do that job. And what they don't understand is, is why government won't move to provide those councillors with wage parity or a fair salary for a job well done. And unfortunately, some of that pressure is coming onto the councillors. And the councillors out there on strike are feeling that pressure because they really don't want to be there, Mr. Speaker. And they know that through this Financial Measures Act, the government can set aside the dollars, put those dollars forward to the board of the RSS, that volunteer board who must negotiate with those councillors, and make an attempt to resolve this strike. They don't want to be there. The family members, those with intellectual disabilities, want to be back, what they call home. They want to be back with those individuals who have provided the services to them. And some of them have been there for 10, 12 years. Despite the talk about a revolving door, there are those who have been there for 10, 12 years. But rather you're there for 1 year or you're there for 10 or 12 years, you are providing a dedicated service that you are committed to. Those individuals are compassionate, caring individuals who look after those family members, as I've said, Mr. Speaker, without being repetitive, time and time again. The Financial Measures Act, if in fact the government, the minister and the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Community Services would have sat down and discussed how best that they could have meted out these dollars, the surplus that this government has benefit from. They could have sat down and they could have discussed how many dollars should go into sustaining social programs, making sure that those programs are enhanced, and making sure that the employees who would benefit from those social programs rightly benefit from. There's also, Mr. Speaker, it's not only the RSS individuals, but in the whole Department of Community Services, there are some areas that truly needed to be looked at with respect to additional dollars. And those additional dollars, instead of going into the hands of some Nova Scotians who least need those dollars, could have been turned back into social programs, which would have benefited many, many, many more Nova Scotians. And Mr. Speaker, what comes to mind, for example, Mr. Speaker, what comes to mind is transition homes and women's centers. There could have been additional dollars there. Many of the constituency representatives, members of the legislature who serve on that side of the government host know full well that they're being taxed to provide services and programs on a very limited budget. We know that. The government knows that. But yet nothing's being done. Some of that $68 million could have very well been set aside for that sort of those sorts of programs. Also, we have in Child Protection Services, we have a report that came forward, Mr. Speaker, called Workload Caseload Overload. And Mr. Speaker, it demonstrated to this government just how